24, 1725, Jonathan Wild, the king of London's thieves and head of organized crime, waits in a cell while the executioner prepares the gallows. Hundreds of people line up to witness his end. The event is so significant that premium tickets are sold to the wealthiest attendees. For years, Wild has played both sides, working for justice by capturing criminals and, on the other hand, leading the era's most successful gang of thieves. This is the story of Jonathan Wild, a vigilante, a criminal, and a master of social manipulation. Jonathan Wild was born in 1682 in Wolverhampton, England, the eldest of 5 children in a modest family. His father worked as a carpenter, and his mother sold herbs and fruits at the local market. Wild received his education at the local school and learned the trade of a buckle-maker. Little did anyone suspect the kind of person he would eventually become. In 1704, now married with a child, he moved to London, seeking work as a servant. After being dismissed, Wild briefly returned to his hometown, only to move back to London in 1708. At this time, London was England's largest city, boasting a population of about 600,000, with around 70,000 residing within the ancient city walls. Wild's first 2 years in London are largely undocumented, but in March 1710, he was arrested for debt and sent to Wood Street Compter, a debtor's prison in London. Conditions in prison were harsh, with corrupt jailers demanding bribes for any comfort. Wild adapted to this system, earning the jailer's favor by running errands. Over time, he managed to pay off his debts and the cost of his imprisonment. He even lent money to fellow prisoners, trading favors and contraband goods. By then, Wild had already become a notable figure in the prison underworld. He also earned the liberty of the gate, allowing him to leave at night to assist in the arrest of thieves. Wild noted the profitable business of incarcerating criminals for money. In prison, Wild met Mary Milliner, a prostitute who introduced him to criminal methods. Through her and other underworld contacts, he acquired criminal skills and connections. Wild was released in 1712 under a parliamentary act meant to alleviate the plight of insolvent debtors. After his release, Jonathan Wild started a domestic partnership with Mary Milliner. Despite both being previously married, he assumed the role of Milliner's protector during her nightly outings and quickly became acquainted with the criminal underworld of London. During this period, Milliner began managing a network of prostitutes, while Wild delved into the trafficking of stolen goods, acting as a middleman and fence. Wild started trading in stolen items and using bribes to release thieves from jail, initially on a smaller scale. However, it appears their marital relationship was troubled, as Wild later separated from Milliner and gruesomely marked her as a prostitute by cutting off her ear. From tavern to crime lord's throne. Since the 1680s, crime in London was on a steady rise, particularly in property-related offenses. This increase coincided with London's growth as a major commercial hub. By 1712, Charles Hitchin, a key figure in London's criminal justice system, claimed to personally know about 2,000 individuals in London who lived solely off theft. A year earlier, in 1711, Hitchin had secured a public position as the under-marshal of the city, essentially becoming the chief of police by paying £700 sterling for the post. Hitchin exploited his position, excessively extorting both thieves and their potential victims. He was notorious for accepting bribes to release criminals from jail, conducting selective arrests, and exploiting molly houses, which were meeting places for homosexual men. Just 2 years later, in 1713, the London Board of Aldermen suspended Hitchin from his position as under-marshal. Around this time, Hitchin approached Wild to recruit him as one of his assistants in capturing thieves, a highly lucrative job since the government typically paid £40 for each criminal apprehended. The advent of newspapers in London had sparked growing public interest in crime and criminals. As newspapers reported on notorious crimes and clever heists, the public became increasingly concerned about property crimes and more invested in safety measures. London relied solely on localized police watchmen and lacked a citywide police force. Public dissatisfaction with crime had reached a critical point. The city's population had more than doubled, yet there were no effective means to control crime. This period saw not only a rise in theft, but also an increase in organized crime. Matters worsened with the end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714. The subsequent influx of demobilized soldiers led to a further increase in criminal activity. During this tumultuous time, Hitchin returned to his office, but Wild charted his own path and opened a small office in the Blue Boar Tavern. This marked the beginning of his solo venture into the criminal underworld. Just as I am beginning this channel in the world of YouTube, I invite you to subscribe and like to support me. If you wish to help further, please leave a comment and share this video with your friends. Thank you, and let's continue. Jonathan Wild's method of amassing illegal wealth while maintaining a facade of legality was cunning. He led a gang of thieves, retained the stolen items, and waited for the thefts to be reported in newspapers. Then, he claimed that his recovery agents, akin to bounty hunters, had found the items and returned them for a reward. If the loot or situation allowed, he practiced extortion before the theft was reported. And Wild didn't just recover goods he had ordered to be stolen, he also offered his help and friendship to the police. This strategy achieved three things. It kept his rivals in jail, expanding his gang's reach and power. It maintained a positive public image, and it ensured loyalty within his gang, as any betrayal would result in imprisonment or even execution. The crime of dealing in stolen goods became increasingly risky between 1700 and 1720, so lower-level thieves faced significant danger. Wild avoided this peril and exploited it simultaneously by having his gang commit thefts, either through pickpocketing or robbery, and then recovering the goods. He consistently claimed to have found the merchandise through police surveillance and professed a deep hatred for thieves. As we saw earlier, Wild wasn't the first thief-taker who was actually a thief himself. Hitchin had used his position as under-marshal to extort money, pressuring brothels and pickpockets to pay him. When Hitchin was suspended for corruption in 1712, he hired Wild to maintain his extortion business in his absence. However, when Hitchin was reinstated in 1714, he found that Wild had become a formidable rival. One of Wild's first gang warfare tactics was to eliminate as many thieves under Hitchin's control as possible. In 1718, Hitchin attempted to expose Wild with his manuscript, a true discovery of the conduct of receivers and thieves in the city of London and its environs, in which he named Wild as a ringleader and source of crime. Wild countered with his own manuscript, an answer to a late insolent libel, where he alleged that Hitchin was a homosexual who frequented molly houses, homosexual brothels. Hitchin tried to further combat Wild with a pamphlet titled The Regulator, which was his characterization of Wild. However, Hitchin's previous suspensions and the shocking accusation of homosexuality virtually eliminated him as a threat. Jonathan Wild held a near monopoly on crime in London, leading to legends about his management of this empire. One legend stated that he kept records of all the thieves in his service, selling them out to the gallows for a £40 reward when they were no longer useful. If a thief angered Wild, he would mark a cross next to their name. A second cross doomed the man to be sold to the crown for execution. Wild portrayed himself as a hero to the public. In 1718, he even declared himself the thief-taker general of Great Britain and Ireland. He claimed to have contributed to the hanging of more than 60 thieves, while secretly maintaining his recovery of lost goods. His efforts to capture thieves were widely publicized, although his true activities remained hidden. His office in Old Bailey became a hub of activity, where victims of theft often found that Wild's agents had already recovered their stolen items, sometimes even before they reported the loss. Wild also offered assistance in capturing criminals for an additional fee. By 1720, his notoriety had grown to the point where even the Privy Council sought his advice on combating crime. Unsurprisingly, he recommended increasing rewards for evidence against thieves, which significantly boosted his own earnings. The reward for capturing a thief went from $40 to $140 in 1 year. There are indications that Wild was favored, or at least tolerated, by certain politicians. In 1718, a conservative group tightened laws against receiving stolen goods, targeting Wild's activities. Ironically, these laws ended up strengthening his position, as they made it harder for thieves to sell their loot through other means. Wild's confrontations with other thieves generated significant media interest. He himself provided newspapers with tales of his exploits, which they disseminated to an increasingly concerned public. In the summer of 1724, newspapers recounted Wild's heroic efforts in capturing 21 members of the Carrot Gang, offering a reward of £800. When one gang member was released, Wild chased and rearrested him, which the public saw as an unwavering defensive order. However, in reality, these actions were nothing more than gang warfare disguised as public service. In 1724, London's political life was in a crisis of public trust. The South Sea bubble had burst 4 years earlier, and the public was increasingly restless about corruption. Authority figures were starting to be viewed with skepticism. In April of 1724, the era's most notorious house thief, Jack Shepherd, was arrested by one of Wild's men for a burglary committed in Clare Market on February 5th. Shepherd had worked with Wild in the past, but had since struck out on his own. He was initially jailed in St. Giles's Roundhouse, but managed to escape within 3 hours. On May 19th, Wild had Shepherd arrested again, this time for theft, and he was locked up in St. Anne's Roundhouse in Soho. During his imprisonment, Elizabeth Edgeworth Bess's Lion visited him. She was also detained, and since they were recognized as husband and wife, both were sent to Clerkenwell's new prison. However, on May 25th, they made a daring escape. In July, Wild received a tip about the whereabouts of Elizabeth Lion. On July 22nd, he plied her with drinks in Temple Bar until she betrayed Shepherd. The next day, Wild had Shepherd arrested for the third time and jailed him in Newgate Prison to await await trial. On August 13th, Shepard was tried for 3 counts of robbery, but was acquitted of the first 2 due to lack of evidence. However, Wilde, with the help of accomplices, presented evidence against him on the final charge of housebreaking. Shepard was found guilty, sentenced to death, and confined in Newgate Prison. The night the death sentence was delivered on August 31st, Shepard managed another miraculous escape. By this point, he had become a working-class hero. On September 9th, he was captured for the 4th time and returned to Newgate, where he was placed in the prison's most secure room, shackled and chained to the floor. On October 9th, Wilde and his men arrested Joseph Blueskin Blake, a bandit and Shepard's accomplice. On October 15th, Blueskin was tried for the same robbery committed on July 12th. Despite inconsistencies in the testimonies given by Wilde's men compared to the evidence presented at Shepard's trial, Blueskin was found guilty and sentenced to death. After the trial, Blueskin, who had previously worked for Wilde, begged him in the courtroom to have his death sentence commuted to penal transportation, but Wilde refused. In a fit of rage, Blueskin attempted to kill Wilde by slashing his throat with a razor. Wilde collapsed and was rushed to a surgeon for treatment. Amidst the ensuing chaos that spread to neighboring Newgate and continued into the night, Shepard made yet another escape on October 16th. He broke chains, locks, and 6 iron-barred doors. This escape astonished everyone. On the morning of November 1st, Shepard was found and arrested for the 5th and final time by an agent. Apparently, he was better at escaping than hiding. This time, he was placed in the center of Newgate, constantly watched, and weighed down with 300 pounds of iron weights. He became so famous that jailers charged high society visitors to see him, and James Thornhill even painted his portrait. On November 11th, Blueskin was hanged. 5 days later, Shepard met a similar fate. Wilde, however, did not attend either execution, as he was bedridden for several weeks, recovering from the throat wound inflicted by Blueskin. Jack Shepard was indeed an incredible character of his time. If you want me to bring his story to the channel, let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to prepare a video. This period was critical for Wilde. Each time Shepard escaped from prison, his fame soared, while it reflected poorly on Wilde, who was increasingly seen as ineffective. All this happened while Wilde was incapacitated, unable to defend his reputation or control his criminal enterprise. As Wilde recovered from his injury, his grip on his criminal gang also weakened, and he began to be despised. Once he recovered, Wilde used violence to help a member of his gang escape from prison. When he became a wanted man himself, he hid for several weeks before returning to business, thinking the matter had blown over. Arrest, trial, and execution. On February 15th, Wilde and his associate Arnold were arrested for orchestrating a jailbreak. Wilde was placed in Newgate Prison, where he tried to continue running his criminal enterprise. Evidence was presented against Wilde for the violent jailbreak and for stealing jewels. Public sentiment had shifted. People were supporting the average man and resenting figures of authority. Wilde's trial occurred simultaneously with the trial of Lord Chancellor, Lord Thomas Parker, the first Earl of Macclesfield, for accepting $100,000 in bribes. With the tide turning, even Wilde's gang began to sense that their leader wouldn't escape this time and started to turn on him. Gradually, gang members began testifying against him, exposing all his activities. Furthermore, evidence of Wilde's frequent bribing of public officials was brought to light. Wilde's final trial took place at Old Bailey on May 15th. He was tried for 2 counts of private robbery. He was acquitted of the first charge, but with the overwhelming evidence against him on the second, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Terrified, Wilde sought a pardon but was denied. He couldn't eat or attend church and suffered from madness and gout. On the morning of his execution, fearful of dying, Wilde attempted suicide by consuming a large dose of laudanum. But weakened by fasting, he violently vomited and fell into a coma from which he never awoke. When he was taken to the gallows on May 24, 1725, the waiting crowd was much larger than any seen before in London. There were cheers and applause, as if it were a triumph. Jonathan Wilde's hanging was a major event, with tickets sold in advance for the best viewing spots. The executioner, Richard Arnott, had been invited to Wilde's wedding years earlier. Under the cover of night, Wilde's body was secretly buried in the cemetery of the old St. Pancras Church next to Elizabeth Mann, his third wife and one of his many lovers, as he had wished. However, his burial was only temporary. In the 18th century, autopsies and dissections were commonly performed on notorious criminals. As a result, Wilde's body was exhumed and sold to the Royal College of Surgeons for dissection. His skeletal remains are publicly displayed at the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Have you heard of Gregor MacGregor? This ambitious man created a fictitious country to sell and make immense wealth. Remember to subscribe and like, and feel free to leave your message in the comments suggesting future topics.